going on, everybody? It's Joe, and welcome back to another episode of Sleeper Sunday. Sleeper Sunday, for those of you that don't know, is a series I came up with showcasing fun hidden decks you may not know about that can deal quite a bit of damage in the proper hands. We'll be going over a basic deck list, strengths, weaknesses, what can be done to make the deck better, and of course a few replays to see the deck in action. In today's episode, to start off the year, we're looking at the winner of this month's poll and a previously defeated member of the poll, Vampire. So Vampire is an archetype of dark zombie monsters that had their first card released with Vampire Lord in Dark Crisis way back in December of 2003, making it by far the oldest archetype we've covered in this series so far, and probably the oldest we will ever cover for now. Despite a couple of cards sprinkled throughout, such as Vampire Genesis in the zombie structure deck, one of the two zombie structure decks at the time, it technically didn't become an archetype with support cards until the first name drop support came out in Shadow Specters back in 2013. They have a few different gimmicks going for themselves, and have actually had a couple of different rewaves and complete archetype overhauls to give the deck new playstyles and meanings throughout its lifespan. This means they've had gimmicks ranging from milling the opponent's deck, to stealing monsters by battle via Go-Yo Guardian effects, to paying and manipulating life points, and even using opponent's monsters for Xyz summons, disregarding their actual level. They also have a combination of Link and Xyz monsters in their extra deck. Starting off is Vampire Familiar. This is one of the cards released out of, I believe it was Dark Saviors, the set that Sky Striker for Hire came out in. This was their really big rewave that completely changed everything about the deck. So Vampire Familiar is a level 1 zombie with 500 attack and 0 defense that says if this card is special summon, you can pay 500 life points to add one vampire monster from your deck to your hand except another copy of itself, and if it's in your graveyard, you can send one vampire card from your hand or face up field to the graveyard, special summon this card but banish it when it leaves the field, and you can only use each effect once per turn. So Familiar is one of the best starter cards that you can have in the deck. Being a level 1 means you can put it in the graveyard easily with things like Link Karibo and Relinquished Anima, and it's also just a good card to have in your graveyard via all of your zombie style milling effects. Everything about zombie just always wants to send things to the graveyard, so you're going to be having this card in the graveyard pretty often, and the same goes for its counterpart, Vampire Retainer. It's a level 2 zombie, 1200 attack and 0 defense, and it does the exact same thing as Familiar word for word, except it adds a spell or trap instead of a monster. So both of these cards, like I said, are just very fantastic starters for the archetype. They're basically going to be fueling all of your plays. The only bad thing about these cards is that they are banished when they leave the field, and there's very few ways to manipulate their levels in order to go into Xyz summons to prevent that from happening. And so you can't, for example, go Familiar effect to summon itself to search, and then use Retainer to send that Familiar because it has to send for cost. So it really does suck that you have to get rid of a lot of resources in your hand or field usually, unless you open the next card we're about to cover, but that doesn't take away from how good these cards are. The card I mentioned is Vampire Ghost. This card came out, I actually forgot which set. It might have been a Battles a Legend, but it was revealed like a good while before we actually got it. But this is a level 3 zombie with 1500 attack and 0 defense. I'm going to stop mentioning that they're zombies because they're all dark zombies. And it says if it's normal summoned, you can send one other vampire card from your hand or face up field to the graveyard to add one level 4 or higher vampire from your deck to your hand, and if you do, send a level 2 or lower vampire from your deck to the graveyard. Also, during the main phase, as a quick effect, you can banish it from your grave and pay 500 life points for cost to immediately normal summon a vampire monster. So this card, if you couldn't tell, is a really insane starter. Basically, opening this plus any of the Retainer or Familiars in your deck is kind of just full combo, go off and do whatever you want, because you're getting one of your 5 or highers, and you're getting both of your level 2 or lowers in your graveyard to get all of your searching done. It also showcases that the archetype has a gimmick around normal summoning, which I think I forgot to mention actually. It's kind of like a weird, it's like Monarchs but not, I don't know. That's kind of the only way I can describe tribute summon archetypes, but they do a lot of special summoning, but they also want to do a lot of tribute summoning. Making it a quick effect is also pretty damn good for some of your certain effects, because you can do things on your opponent's turn, such as summon things from their graveyard, summon a disruption, for the very little ones that they actually have. This card honestly kind of carries the whole archetype on its shoulders, and yeah, it does kind of suck that you have to open another vampire card like one of these to get maximum value out of it, but that does not at all take away from just how important this card is, and it's so good that it actually takes away the importance of Unizombie. Our first of the 5 or higher vampires is Vampire Fraulein. She is a level 5 with 600 attack and 2000 defense that says when a monster declares an attack, you can special summon her from your hand in defense position. You can only use this effect once per turn. Once per battle, if your zombie monster battles an opponent's monster, during that damage calculation quick effect, you can pay life points in multiples of 100 to a maximum of 300 or 3000, your battling monster gains that much attack and defense during that damage calculation only, and at the end of the battle phase, if it destroyed any monsters by battle, you can special summon them from the graveyards to your field. So Fraulein is a bit of an interesting card because a lot of people underestimate battle phase focused effects, but Fraulein in particular is very, very powerful. You're going to be doing a lot of life point manipulation, and having low life points isn't a super big deal for this deck because they have a card that can make them gain it back in maximum potential later on that we'll mention. But I love that this is basically a non-once per turn honest, because you're almost always going to just turn whatever your vampire's stat is to plus 100 over your opponent's monster's stat. And also, like I said, they have that Go-Yo Guardian effect on some of them in this rewave, which is present here in Fraulein. The only thing I don't like about Fraulein is that it's really annoying that she summons in defense position, right? Because you'd think it'd be really, really cool if you were getting direct attacked or something, and you specialed the Fraulein, and they wanted to get rid of some of your life points, so they make you pay life points to destroy one of their monsters by battle, but then you get to special summon that monster to your field, which is really, really cool. But unfortunately, we can't have super nice things, and all of the other things in the deck that summon her in attack position always seem to want to not let her attack, but between Scarlet Scourge that we'll mention in a minute. But it's really funny to me. Overall, though, Fraulein is a really good card, helps you beat over a lot of problematic threats, and will keep your life points safe, even while she's paying them in turn. We're also playing one copy of Shadow Vampire. This is actually one of their slightly older cards. I believe this one was in Shadow Specters. It says it cannot be used as material for an Xyz summon except for the summon of a dark monster. A lot of the older ones have this, but I don't think we're playing too many of those. But it says when it's normal summon, you can special summon one dark vampire monster from your hand or deck except Shadow Vampire, but monsters you control cannot attack for the rest of the turn except that monster. So Shadow Vampire is interesting. This card seems really good because it summons from deck, and it is really good for that when you're going first. But when you're trying to go second with the deck, which is really crucial in the going second variant of this deck, because there is a going second build that isn't as good in my opinion, it's really annoying that only the monster you summon can attack, especially because there are a lot of other cards, such as their rank 5, that also has an attack restriction thing, to potentially make it to where you can't attack at all. But Shadow Vampire is really, really good going first. Of course, you can summon anything you want from your deck. You can summon one of your 5 or 6s for a rank 5 or 6 play, or you can even summon your Retainer or Familiar to trigger their special summon effects, because they don't have to be summoned by their own effects in order to get that search. So Shadow Vampire does a lot of work going first, but there's so many ways to search him that you don't really need to play multiples of him, and so we're just playing the one. Part of the rewave was Vampire Scarlet Scourge, one of their first level 6 monsters. It says on summon, period, you can pay 1000 life points and target one vampire in your graveyard except Scarlet Scourge, and special summon it, but it cannot attack this turn, and it also has the Go-Yo Guardian effect. So Scarlet Scourge is a pretty decent card when it comes to spamming the board for Link and Xyz fodder, and that's basically the extent of his purpose. You can summon him off a Shadow Vampire, and because he works on special summon as well, you can summon another body from grave, and then you can go into a rank 5, rank 6, link 2, 3, whatever you want to do. It does kind of suck that you can't attack with the monster that you summon, because otherwise it would make Fraulein feel really, really good. But I mean, you kind of have to give some to take some. The only other level 6 we're playing is Vampire Red Baron. He says once per turn you can pay 1000 life points and target one monster your opponent controls and one other vampire you control. Switch control of those monsters, and it has the Go-Yo effect. So it seems pretty unassuming, especially because, I mean, you're giving them a monster, so it's not as good as just stealing. But the big thing is that they not only have ways of actually stealing from the field so you can get that monster back, but you are going to be utilizing your opponent's monster in order to Xyz summon using any level you want. They can literally use any level for their Xyz monsters, which is insane. So what you can do is you can just switch over the Red Baron or something to their field while you take one of their important monsters, and then you link climb into their link 3 that can steal something from the field by attributing another vampire, and then you can just get your Red Baron back and break their board basically entirely. Admittedly, it's not the best card in the deck, but it is still a pretty solid card when it does come up, especially if you can summon it off of your Scarlet Scourge. Finally, we are playing a level 8, and this is their recent Vampire Voivode. I'm just going to call it Voivode because I don't know how to actually pronounce it. But it is a level 8 with 2800 attack and 21 defense, and it says if it's normal summon, you can target up to 2 monsters in your opponent's graveyard, special summon those monsters to your field in defense position, but their effects are negated. When a monster's effect is activated while a monster with its same name is in the graveyard, you can negate the activation. And if a monster is special summoned from your opponent's graveyard, you contribute 2 monsters to special summon this card from your graveyard. So Voivode as a card is pretty interesting. So it is a level 8, meaning you do have to tribute 2 to actually summon it, but you can bypass this a little bit with one of their cards we will talk about later in the extra deck, but it does a lot just on its own. because you're summoning 2 monsters from your opponent's graveyard should they have any, meaning that you can use those instantly for one of their rank 6s or their rank 8, which are both very important for the deck. The negation effect is pretty solid, despite the fact that you're not always going to have this guy on the board, especially because its tribute effect is pretty steep of a cost, because it doesn't get its summon like a normal summon effect on special summon as well. But it is still a pretty solid negation, especially because it works against things that tribute for cost. So like you can negate, I don't know, a Pankratops, for example, like a random example, but like that's just something I can think of, or like a Rescue Rabbit effect or something like that. Pretty damn cool. And that is actually it for the vampire monsters. We are playing zombies, so of course we are playing some generic zombie support. Uni Zombie definitely is the quote-unquote slightly worse normal summon of the deck compared to Vampire Ghost, but it is still an incredibly powerful card. Not to mention it doesn't have to work on normal summon, meaning that if you like dump it off of your rank 8 that we'll talk about, everyone's seen Zombie Vampire before, then you can special it back off of like Mizuki or something, or special it off the rank 8. Really, really cool. You can get a lot of uses out of it and Vampire Ghost in the same turn, which is awesome. Speaking of Mizuki, we're playing a zombie deck, and so Mizuki is always welcome. We're also playing 1 copy of Eldritch because we do have a few continuous spells and stuff that we can get rid of just to get like an extra big body or a free link material, or even to just get some targeting sending from the hand. We are also playing 1 Necroworld Banshee with the Zombie World that I will mention here. So it does suck if you mill the Zombie World on top of the Necroworld Banshee, but it's like not the end of the world. But the Necroworld Banshee has some pretty cool combos with the deck. Again, once we'll go into the extra deck and we'll talk about one of the cards in there. So it also works against a lot of like effects that lose to Zombie World's Floodgate. So pretty solid overall. To wrap up the monsters, we are playing the Horus engine, and let me tell you, adding this was the only thing that kept my sanity together and made me commit to this deck after almost abandoning it for a second time for Sleeper Sunday. For those of you who don't know, Vampire was actually going to be one of the earlier Sleeper Sundays on the series, but I literally abandoned it because it was so bad. And so I was like, okay, it's gotten some new stuff now, it can probably be a little bit better between like Voivode and things like that. It did not work out. I was playing a blind second build because I figured that'd probably be the best way to play it, because it revolves around your opponent having monsters engraved that you can utilize to steal and everything like that, and there's some like things you want to steal on the field, be over, steal monsters. I was like, okay, that'd probably be the best way to play the deck, and I suffered so hard. Even opening board breakers and stuff. Both this format just has so many things to keep track of between the hand, field, and grave that board breakers just aren't really that great. And also, it's like even if you open a board breaker, your hand had to be perfectly sculpted to even play through 1 disruption. It felt so bad. But now with the Horus engine, we actually have access to the Zombie Vampire, which, I mean, every deck that plays the Horus engine plays this card, right? But this is actually a vampire card. Like, it actually fits along with the gimmick. And so this will single-handedly make this deck not only playable, but also able to go first instead of having to blind second and pray. Not to mention, it also gives it some very needed follow-up, especially because the Familiar and Retainer banish themselves when they leave the field. So it's very important that you have these extra bodies, especially under something like Zombie World, where you can go into your Link monsters with them. Moving on to the back row, we have 2 copies of Vampire's Domain. It is a continuous spell that says once per turn you can pay 500 life points. During your main phase this turn, you can normal summon 1 vampire in addition to your normal summon or set, even if this card leaves the field. And each time your vampire inflicts battle damage to your opponent, gain the same amount of life points. So Vampire's Domain actually used to be like the most important card in the deck because you needed it desperately to get access to multiple normal summons. But Vampire Ghost has since made it like slightly less crucial because you can use his graveyard effect to banish and pay 500 instead. But Domain is still a very, very solid card. Getting that additional normal summon for something like a Scarlet Scourge or even like a Voivode or something is pretty damn good, especially if you do have to start off by normal summoning like a Familiar to make Link Revo instead. And then also, because it keeps that effect even if it leaves the field, you can send it off your Familiar or your Retainer or even something like your Golden Lord and still have that additional normal. Also, the second effect is really, really good if it can stay on the field, because you can deal upwards of like 6,000 plus damage to your opponent in 1 turn, and then gain all the life points that you ended up paying off Fraulein, Familiar, Retainer, Domain, Ghost, etc., Scarlet Scourge, all of your cards basically. You can get like all of that back and then some, and so you'll be sitting with over 8,000 life points while you're chipping away at your opponent's board. Very, very good card. We also have 2 copies of Vampire's Desire. It is a normal spell that says activate one of these effects. Either target 1 face-up monster you control and send 1 vampire monster from your deck to the graveyard with a different level, and change that targeted monster's level to that level until the end of the turn. Or target 1 vampire monster in your graveyard, send 1 monster you control to the graveyard, and if you do, specially targeted monster. And you can only activate 1 Desire per turn. So most of the time you're using Desire as an additional copy of Foolish, though the level modulation part of it is also pretty damn cool. And also we are playing like the one Foolish additionally on top of this so that we can send more generic things. But Desire is really important. It's a lot more important than I actually used to think when I played Vampire when I was younger, because I really just thought Desire was like kind of an extender, maybe sometimes, that would just put like a familiar engrave or something if you needed it. But it actually means that starting with Retainer is pretty damn solid, because you can use the Retainer to search for Desire, and then use the Desire to dump the familiar, and then start going off with your plays from there so you can get access to both, because most hands aren't going to do anything if you don't have access to both Retainer and Desire, and familiar, sorry. The second effect I don't think I've really ever used. Like, it's pretty neat that you can summon your Link monsters and stuff, but like, it would be cool if it could like summon an Xyz and like attach itself as material so you could actually do something with it, but it's still fine. We're also playing 3 copies of Droplet because we do still want an additional way to go second if we have to. We're also playing a zombie deck, so putting things in graveyard is pretty good. And also, it's good to make things more easy to beat over, and also good to going first because you can only set up so much disruption with this deck going first, but you do still want to go first. So having a Droplet on top of your actual disruptions is still pretty nice to have. We're also playing one Monster Reborn because things are going to be touching the graveyard a lot. The Foolish, as I mentioned, and Called By, just so we don't get hand trapped very often. And onto the trap cards, we have one Vampire Domination. It is a counter trap that says when a spell or trap card or monster effect is activated while you control a vampire monster, negate the activation, and if you do destroy it, then if it was a monster card, gain life points equal to its original attack, and you can only activate 1 per turn. This card is one of your key end board pieces if you're able to access it. If you have enough extension, you don't have to search like Desire or something off of Retainer, you usually just search this instead. And the life point gain is pretty damn solid here as well. Again, you're paying a lot of life points going first to set up your board, and you'll probably be at like 6,000 or something. So being able to pop a monster and then gain that life points back is pretty cool. Other than that though, it's an Infernity barrier for an archetype, not really much to say there. Finally, we have Vampire Awakening. It is a normal trap that says special summon 1 vampire monster from your deck, but destroy during the end phase of this turn, and you can only activate 1 per turn. Very simple card. Honestly, probably cuttable because it's not like the most important card, but it is pretty decent in case you have to commit all of your resources for like Link monsters like SP Little Knight, or if your Link monster gets removed and you need another way to keep your domination live. And you can also use it to summon something like Familiar, Retainer, or Scarlet Scourge on the opponent's turn to get their effects, so that's pretty decent. But more often than not, actually, if you're not sending this off of your Familiar or Retainer if you feel like you don't need it, you're using it to do what the artwork describes, and you're summoning Fraulein in order to protect yourself in the battle phase. That is it for the main deck. Moving on to the extra deck, we have Dhampir Vampire Sheridan to start us off. This is a rank 6 with 2600 attack and 1000 defense that requires 2 or more level 6 monsters. It was part of the rewave that gave us things like the Familiar, Retainer, etc. And it says if you use a monster with a level that is owned by your opponent for the Xyz summon of this card, you can treat them as level 6. Once per turn, you can attach 1 material from this card, then target 1 card your opponent controls and send it to the graveyard. And once per turn, if a monster card is sent from the field to your opponent's graveyard by a card effect, or a monster is destroyed by battle and sent to your opponent's graveyard, you can attach 1 material from this card and special summon that monster or monsters into your field in defense position. So Sheridan's pretty interesting. It's actually not the strongest set of effects, especially when we get to the Zombie Vampire, which again, I'm pretty sure everybody knows by now. But Dhampir is really, really cool because you can use up to like as many monsters you control that were your opponents as you want as level 6s regardless of their actual level. So sometimes you'll end off on this just to use your opponent's monsters in case there's something engraved you want to take that you don't want them to have, or something on field for example, and sometimes the resurrection effect can come up in case you pop something on your opponent's turn like with domination, or if they pop something via their own effect. But mostly this is a really good card on turn 3 or going second when you're trying to break apart your opponent's board. What it really wants you to do, if you couldn't tell, is send an opponent's monster with its effect and then summon it back with the second effect, detaching both materials to get that monster to your side of the field. Not like the biggest thing ever, and usually I want to get rid of like floodgates or any other powerful back row cards with it, or even something like a Link monster that can't be summoned back in defense position, but it's still a really solid card just by being able to use your opponent's monsters for it. Slightly less interesting and actually older is Crimson Knight Vampire Bram. This is their first Xyz monster. It is a rank 5 that requires 2 level 5 zombie monsters. You can attach 1 material from this card, then target 1 monster in your opponent's graveyard, special that target to your field, but only that monster can attack for the rest of the turn. Once per turn, during the standby phase of the next turn after this card you control was destroyed by an opponent's card and sent to your graveyard, special summon this card in defense position. So if you couldn't tell, Bram is kind of mediocre. So the main use for Bram is going to be special summoning something to your field from your opponent's graveyard that you don't want them to have. A DPE, for example, is something that can come up that like you don't want them to resurrect it and you want to keep it to your field. And the attack restriction, like especially combined with Shadow Vampire, is like really, really annoying. but it is a decent way of getting something to your board to exceed off into your Sheridan or your zombie vampire, or even to use as link fodder for some of your other monsters. The destruction effect is almost never going to come up, admittedly, so Bram really is like kind of a last-ditch card, especially because you prefer to make a rank 6 than a rank 5, or even a link 2 most of the time. Alright, finally, let's address the elephant in the room, that being the zombie vampire. So everyone that's seen the Horus engine or tier or anything like that knows exactly about this card, but did you know that, again, it is a vampire monster, so it actually synergizes with the archetype. It says if you use a monster with a level that is owned by your opponent for the exceed zone of this card, treat it as a level 8, which is actually something being utilized by decks like Castra or like any other deck that can make Big Eye, so that it can actually make a Big Eye and use Hidden Armory with Stat Steal to steal an opponent's monster and make Zombie Vampire. It also says neither player can target this card with effects of special summon monsters except those summoned from the graveyard, and you can attach a material to mill the top 4 from both decks. Then, if any monsters were sent, you can special summon one of those monsters to your field. So Zombie Vampire is good in like every other deck, and those decks are better than Vampire, but it's better for Vampire than it is for any of those other decks. So Zombie Vampire can be used with any number of monsters, as long as there's at least 2. You can use monsters that are owned by your opponent as any level, which you're going to be doing. It has the good protection, which makes it a decent thing to sit on and wait for another turn. And the milling in a zombie deck, especially Vampire, that has all these things engraved that they want to use, plus specialing a monster from the opponent's grave to use again for something like a Sheridan, is really, really good. And not to mention, you're going to be making this a lot off the Horus engine like most other decks, but you're going to be using the Horus engine almost exclusively for this as opposed to like Beat Sticks. What you could also use them for though is Photon Lord. We are playing this in case we don't need to go into the Zombie Vampire if we're playing against like a graveyard focused deck, or in case we're going second and break the board and need to use them for something else, or in case we just really don't need the extra extension Zombie Vampire provides in the rare chance that happens. Photon Lord is a good way to protect from Nib or anything like that. Just a really solid card overall. Onto the Link monsters, we of course have Link Kribo and Anima, like I mentioned earlier. Really good targets for Familiar, especially Anima going second helps you break boards and dodge disruptions. And then moving on to their first Link monster, we have Vampire Sucker. This was one of the first Link monsters actually in the game to my memory, now that I think about it. Actually, it might have been Flames of Destruction, so it was pretty early on, but it wasn't one of the first, I don't know. But I just know this card used to be like a $60 secret rare, it's so funny. But it is a zombie Link 2 with down left and down right arrows that requires 2 zombie monsters. And it says if you attribute a monster for a tribute summon, you contribute a zombie your opponent controls even though you do not control them. And you can only use each of the following effects as Sucker once per turn. You can target one monster in your opponent's graveyard, special summon it to their field in defense position, but it becomes a zombie monster. And if another zombie is specialed from either graveyard, you can draw 1 card. Or actually not you can, you must draw 1 card. So Vampire Sucker was really popular for not only having one of the best like judge mats and field centers, one of the first ones that I've seen when field centers came out, but also because it was really good in Zombie World when that structure deck came out. Zombie was actually a really popular budget rogue deck that was actually getting a lot of tops here and there, and Vampire Sucker was a very, very expensive card because of that. Like I said, it was like a $60 secret rare, and you needed at least 2. It was ridiculous. But now the card's like super cheap, so it's not really that important. But again, like Zombie Vampire, Vampire Sucker is even better in this deck than it is for other decks that used it, because the tribute summon effect seems pretty irrelevant other than just her special summon effect, because I mean that's the only way you're giving your opponent a zombie, until you read Zombie World again and realize that this plus Zombie World plus like Voivode especially is insane for board breaking. Not to mention the second effect to Jada, a draw card if something is summoned, is really, really good. Does suck that it's a mandatory for some reason, meaning that if it gets impermed, it's going to pop off anyway, and can trigger things like Thrust. But it's a really good way at drawing follow-up cards or even drawing extensions, such as Imseti, as you will see in one of these replays, I believe. This card just feels really, really good, and you're going to be making it just about every single turn, and maybe even ending on it sometimes with your domination. We are also playing IP and SP because we are a bad deck and need IP and SP to actually help us carry. And for their last Link monster, we have Vampire Fascinator. This is a actually more recent Link 3 with top down left and down right arrows and 2400 attack, and it requires 2 or more monsters including a zombie monster. It says if this card is Link summoned, you can target 1 monster in your opponent's grave, special it to your field in defense position, but you're locked into zombies for the rest of the turn, and you contribute 1 vampire monster to target 1 monster your opponent controls, take control of it until the end phase. So Vampire Fascinator was actually a really mediocre card at first, Vampire really did not have very many ways of swarming even with Vampire Ghost, and a lot of the time you'd rather just not really make Fascinator over just making anything else. But now that the Horus engine is here to actually give you a lot more extension, especially in the form of the zombie vampire, Fascinator easily shines as one of the best cards in the entire extra deck. Being able to take 2 of your opponent's monsters, one from grave and one from field, each turn basically that you have her, is really cool, and it'll fuel a lot of your plays between zombie vampire, Sheridan, even like your vampire sucker. And I really like that it requires only 1 zombie monster bare minimum, because that means you can steal your opponent's monsters and use them for links more reliably. Usually you're going to be utilizing Vampire Sucker's effect to special summon a monster from the opponent's graveyard turn 1 if you put one in grave with like Sucker if they use a hand trap, and then you're going to draw a card off Sucker and then link Sucker off into Fascinator. Fascinator can steal another monster from their graveyard, and then you can use Fascinator to summon to steal the monster that you summon to their field off of your Vampire Sucker to go into your play, such as your Dompier Vampire Sheridan. Really great card. I cannot recommend it highly enough. And then finally, we are playing a couple of synchro monsters because Unizombie is in the deck, and so we can actually go into some synchro plays. We have Red Eye Zombie, Necro Dragon, and Dragon Lord that we can use. Really nothing too much to say. I don't think I ever make these at all. I might actually end up replacing them, not gonna lie, with other cards. Not too sure which ones yet. But yeah, they are here in the off chance that you do want to make them with Unizombie. So that is it for the actual deck profile itself. Moving on to the cards that you could play or that are in the Vampire archetype that we don't play. There are a lot of cards in this deck. I mean, it's a literal 21-year-old archetype, quote unquote. So there's bound to be a lot of cards, and a lot of these are actually from their first like wave out of Shadow Specters, but a lot of them are also just from random in-between stuff. We have Vampire Vamp. She says once per turn when this card is a vampire is normal summon to your field, you can target one monster your opponent controls with higher attack than this card and equip it to this card, and it gains attack equal to the combined original attack of the monsters equipped to it. And if this card is sent to the grave while equipped with the card by this effect, you special summon it. So Vamp isn't even a bad card, and if this card were like a level 5 or 6, I would even be inclined to say this card is fantastic. The main issue comes from it being a level 8, and you don't have too many ways to reliably put enough bodies on board to summon a level 8, hence why Voivode is kind of awkward sometimes. But even Voivode at least gives you immediate value by being able to make a zombie vampire or Sheridan with this effect. Vamp requires a little bit more like actual setup. But it is pretty cool if you do have it on your end board and you have Ghost in your graveyard, because then you can actually use that to summon a monster on the opponent's turn to get an equip. The main issue is that it has to equip things with higher attack than it, which means that after like one equip, it's not really going to be that reliable. Vampire Grace is actually a card that I used to play, and I just kind of stopped playing it because it felt a little bit clunky. It says when a level 5 or higher zombie monster is special to your field by the effect of a zombie monster while this card's in your graveyard, you can pay 2,000 life points to special it from your grave, and you can only use this effect of Grace once per turn. And once per turn, you can declare one card type between monster, spell, or trap, and make your opponent send one card of that type from their deck to the graveyard. So this card does showcase the milling/bleed mechanic that they tried giving the deck at first, which eventually ended up falling off, of course, because it's really bad to let your opponent choose to send things from their deck to the graveyard. But Grace used to be a pretty decent level 6 extender, but she does just get a little bit in the way now because she requires so many life points just to summon her, and not to mention you're going to want to try and do this as many turns as you can, and it's a little bit too specific of a cost. Like if it just said a 5 or higher zombie is special to your field, period, instead of just by the effect of a zombie monster, it'd be better. But overall, I mean, there's just better options, especially now that Ghost is such a good starter that you don't really need as many extenders. Duke falls under a similar vein in that it's actually not a bad card at all, we just don't really play it anymore because it became a little bit clunky. There's just too many level 5 or higher really. It says it can't be used as a material for a summon except for a dark monster. When it's normal summon, you can target a dark vampire in your grave and special in defense position, and if it's special summon, you can do the bleed mechanic just like Grace can. So basically it's just Scarlet Scourge but without like the life point cost or anything like that, so it's not a bad card at all. But if it was a level 6, it'd probably be better, which is why we're playing Scarlet Scourge at 2 copies, because making Sheridan is just much more important than making Bram. So Duke ended up just being cut in the end because it was just so many better other options to play. Vampire Grimson came from the Rewave and is featured in the artwork of Vampire's Domain, which, can I mention, is such a pretty artwork, by the way. But it basically just says if a monster you control be destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, you can pay 1,000 life points for each monster that will be destroyed instead, but you must protect all of the monsters at the same time, and at the end of the battle phase, it has the Go Your Guardian effect. Grimson, not a terrible card, but it doesn't really do anything other than the protection, so really there'd be no purpose in summoning this other than like off of Awakening just to like protect your field, but it's just such, again, a steep life point cost, especially if your opponent tries to use like Regeki or something, and you're sitting there like, ooh, do I want to pay like 5,000-6,000 life points if I even have that much? it just really doesn't feel that great. Vampire's Curse is a really old bad card that says during the standby after it was destroyed by battle and sent to grave, you can pay 500 to special it and make it gain 500 attack. Doesn't really do anything for the deck. It's not really a starter and extender, and it's not going to be destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard. Vampire Dragon, as Rada mentioned in his archetype archive, it was literally just here because I'm pretty sure it was in like a card creation contest thing. Doesn't really do anything for vampires at all. More interestingly though is Vampire Lord and Vampire Genesis being some of the first, if not the first with Vampire Lord, vampire monsters in like period at all. So this does the bleed mechanic when it does damage, Vampire Lord does, and once returned during your next standby after it was destroyed and sent to the grave by an opponent's card effect, special summon it from the graveyard. This card isn't very great. Vampire Genesis says that you must special summon it by banishing a Vampire Lord, and once per turn you can discard a zombie to target a zombie in your graveyard with a level less than it, and then special that target. Both these cards are like either bad or just really mediocre in Genesis's case. But funnily enough, this was actually mentioned on one of my very old Twitter accounts in a Dazif video where he was talking about like childhood Yu-Gi-Oh! Where I mentioned that I used to stack my deck as a kid. I'd put Call of the Mummy, which is just Valhalla for zombie monsters, Vampire Lord and Vampire Genesis on top of my deck, and then I would like change the rules where you could attack on your first turn, we had like 2,000 life points or something like that, and I would just stack my deck every game and then insta win. It was so much fun. And even after I stopped stacking my deck, it was still like basically my combo, like quote unquote. It was like my strategy or whatever, even though the cards were very fake. And then my dog, which probably can't see him, he's present in the background right there. Yeah, he actually shredded them. He shredded my a lot of my old fake cards in one of my decks and a lot of my like structure deck cards. Yeah, even though these cards are like really bad, they're like super nostalgic to me because they were like some of my very first cards that I had and some of the very first like ace monster things that I had. So they're very fun even though they kind of suck. Vampire Hunter is not even a zombie, he's a warrior, and he's just there as a Castlevania reference because Konami likes referencing their other IPs in Yu-Gi-Oh! Vampire Lady literally just has the same battle damage effect as Vampire Lord but on a level 4. Vampire Sorcerer, actually not a horrible card. It says, if this card in your possession is sent to the graveyard by your opponent, you can add a dark vampire monster or vampire spell or trap from your deck to your hand, and you can banish it from your graveyard to make one dark vampire able to be normal summoned without tributing this turn. So first effect doesn't really matter at all unless you're like setting it and passing, which is bad. But the second effect is definitely like the main point of this card. So you can send it off things like Familiar or Retainer to get it in graveyard really easy, or even off a Vampire Ghost, which is pretty cool. And so you can use this to get something like a Voivode or like a Scarlet Scourge or something out without tributing, which is actually pretty cool. It's just that in practice, this card is actually kind of clunky. When I played it like 2 copies, I think, because it was like pretty important at the time. But it really doesn't get you too far, honestly, especially because it doesn't give you an additional normal summon on top of that. So it's like, kind of just not really worth it. Vampire Baby sure did have the Go-Yo Guardian effect before the other vampires did. That's all I can say about it. So Vampire actually ended up getting a field spell called Vampire Kingdom that says zombie monsters gain 500 attack during damage calculation only, and once per turn when a card is sent from your opponent's deck to the graveyard, target one card in the field, send one dark vampire monster from your hand or deck to the graveyard, and if you do, destroy that target. So you could play this card that wants you to focus on the bleed mechanic against your opponent, where you're getting them free advantage or sending things from their deck to the graveyard, or by sitting and waiting for your opponent to like, please be playing a deck that sends from deck to graveyard, or you could activate Zombie World and get so much more value. On top of that, they even have their own in-archetype metaverse called Vampire Takeover. If you have nothing in your field zone and all your face-up monsters are zombies, you place the Vampire Kingdom directly from your deck, and then you can special summon a Dark Vampire from your grave in defense position. If this could activate something like Zombie World instead, it'd be insane. Other than that, it's terrible. And finally, because we are playing the Zombie World stuff, and the end board isn't like anything too spectacular most of the time, you could in theory play something like Doom King Baller's Rock to get all of his really, really crazy effects while Zombie World's on board. But it's not like we're playing a Zombie World focused deck. We only have like the 1 and the 1 Necroworld Banshee. And if we tried putting any more in, or things like Blow Up Bloom as well, at that point you wouldn't be playing better Vampire, you'd be playing worse Zombie World. And so really, I don't really think it's like the most important thing. Maybe if we were playing like the Vampire Kingdom and Takeover package, like some other lists I was seeing are actually playing, then yeah, we could play the Baller's Rock reliably, but other than that, I don't think it's really worth it. Of course, that is going to do it for the alternatives, and without further ado, let's go ahead and get right into some replays. Alright, that does it for the replays that I had gathered for this deck. I painstakingly got these all myself over the span of about a day and a half, something like that. It was a lot of work between a lot of like disconnects, a lot of people just sitting there stalling, things like that, and of course a lot of losses because this deck's not that great. But moving on, let's go ahead and talk about these strengths and weaknesses. Starting off with the strengths, being zombies means they'll always have access to generic zombie support, so long as Konami keeps making it, which, let's be real, they will. But unfortunately, Konami's been pretty stingy as of late with giving Zombie anything other than just special discard from the graveyard or something. But I mean, the point still stands. As long as zombies get generic support, Vampire will also be indirectly supported in some way. As I mentioned earlier, Vampire Ghost on its own is a really powerful card. Like, it's one a lot of archetypes would kill for, and it sets up a lot of your plays, and the archetype can easily be built around it for future support. It also, like I said, breaks the zombie curse of normal summoning Uni Zombie and immediately dying to removal because it doesn't do anything on summon. The level ignoring mechanic, if that's what you want to call it, with their Xyz monsters, is pretty damn useful. It's very unique and gives actual purpose to stealing your opponent's monsters from the field and grave, especially if you're playing against a weaker deck and you're not stealing any boss monsters. Like, imagine if you stole a Prank Kid or something, for example. Like, what would you do with that? Finally, the Horus Engine synergy here is just absurd. You get to set up your grave with this card, summon big bodies, make an in-archetype card to get more graveyard shenanigans going off, especially your guys without banishing them. It gives you follow-up overall that makes the deck just feel a lot better without them on its own. But of course, for each strength, there is at least one weakness, and there's actually more weaknesses to this deck than there are strengths for once. Firstly, the deck relies on level 5 and higher monsters. A lot. And without access to things like Ghost or Domain, it's going to be really hard to get reliable access to those level 5s on board. And even when you do have them, all the normal summons in the world aren't going to matter when you don't have the tribute fodder to summon them. Yes, Vampire Sorcerer is technically a workaround, but the card otherwise doesn't do very much. It ends up being a brick more often than not, just like level 5s in the deck when you don't see a starter. Also, a lot of the cards really want you to go second, like super bad. They won't do anything without the opponent having a monster. So much so that, again, I actually tried playing blind second Vampire, and yeah, if you follow me on Twitter, you know exactly how that went. Speaking of going second, for a deck that wants to do that, it seems it really doesn't want the cards to let you. Even making Shadow Vampire and Bram say other monsters can attack directly instead of period would be like a lot better, because at least you can utilize the reborn effects of your vampires that are swinging, and even push for game with Frau Lion in some instances. Also, speaking of going second, it suffers from the case of wanting to do so, but having very little in-archetype ways of breaking boards. Red Baron is okay, but much rather would have setup for a sucker on top of it for actual value. Sheridan is really good admittedly, but can only do so much on its own, and Sucker only works well with Zombie World for the tributing, and Fascinator requires 3 link materials and another vampire in your field to actually do anything useful. Finally, when you do go first, there's only so much the vampire cards on their own can do. Your best end boards are like Sucker, Domination, SP Pass, and those cards aren't even always guaranteed, so you're kind of just praying a lot of the time. So how are we making Vampire better? This seems like a huge dumpster fire with all the ways I'm talking about it, but I actually think it's pretty simple overall. So first, please give the deck a way of board breaking in the main deck. Even something as simple as a spell that just says immediately normal summon a vampire, and then you can destroy cards your opponent controls up to the number of vampire monsters you control. Like, even something like that would just be so simple, yet so good. It gives you yet another easy way for an additional normal summon, while being some removal and getting searchable off Retainer, so it's a viable option instead of going for Domain if you don't want the life points or the extra card to send. I would also really love to see another low-level starter or extender to work with Vampire Ghost, similar to Familiar and Retainer. It doesn't have to be super crazy either, like I mostly just want it for the extra tribute and link fodder more than anything, but something simple like pay 500 to special it from grave and dump a vampire monster maybe? Giving you more access to Familiar and Retainer while also being an additional body, since the deck struggles to swarm enough while getting multiple plays going. This next one isn't super important and may seem a bit controversial, but I think it'd be cool to see a retrain of Vampire Kingdom and, hear me out, make it similar to Zombie World. At least in the sense of turning monsters into zombies, even if it's just on the field. This would make it slightly worse than Zombie World for other zombie decks, so they wouldn't want to play it, but give vampires more ways to utilize Sucker's board breaking in particular. I don't know, it seems just pretty cool. Finally, some more going first options in particular would be really, really nice. As it stands, the deck has nothing to do going first except for what I mentioned in the weaknesses section. So even just a rank 5 or 6 with a quick effect removal would feel better than nothing, not to mention it'd be pretty cool if it could also work with Sheridan. So I think that's all I can say logistically about Vampire. Y'all, this one almost broke me as much as Gimmick Puppet did. This one was really difficult, especially until I added the Horus cards in, because the Horus cards, while they were like really good for the deck, still can only do so much on their own. It just feels really clunky to play overall, and just feels a lot worse than any other deck that does similar things, especially when it comes to decks utilizing the Horus engine. And I think that sucks though, because I think the theming, especially the artwork and stuff of vampires, is really cool. Fraulein especially just has such a beautiful gothic design, and even cards like Crimson as well. Like, they all just feel so cool to look at, that it's really disappointing that they're not really that strong. And again, I'm really biased because I have a super soft spot for Vampire being one of the first archetypes, quote unquote, that I've ever actually been exposed to. And so I would really love for just a few more cards to help push the archetype, something that actually focuses on the like more modern gimmicks as opposed to like the bleed gimmicks, because wow, this deck has a lot of gimmicks. But I think that even with at least a few of the cards that I mentioned that you could give them, I think it would just make it so much better, even at just being a lower level event deck. But I don't know, that's just my opinion. Let me know yours down in the comments below, because that's gonna do it for the video. If you liked it, please sure to leave a like, as I'll split this video and the channel into recommended. And if this content was really like the rest of my Sleeper Sunday series, we're about to hit the 2-year anniversary next month, which is insane. Then perhaps consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because we're on our way to 10,000 subscribers by the end of 2024. Not to mention, it supports the channel more than anything else, and it's absolutely free. Also, if you want to support me directly while getting some awesome DJ merchandise in the process, check out Tapio cards in the link down below. Use code Aurora5 for 5% off your purchase at checkout, and support me financially. Also, remember that once a month, I do host a poll in the community tab where you can choose which deck is going to be used for Sleeper Sunday. They're never up for more than 24 hours, so always keep your eye out and make sure you vote when you can. If you want to be directly involved with which decks get on the poll, be sure to check out my Patreon, also linked down below, and join the $5 a month tier. You also get access to all sorts of other awesome benefits, such as getting access to all of my PNGs that I use, early access to videos, and other awesome things. Once again, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Aurora, signing off.